It was late April 1945, a tiny hamlet beyond Hamburg. Rainwater seeps through the damaged ceiling of an abandoned schoolhouse, its windows sealed tight from outside. Within, 19 German women rest on freezing stone ground, starving, shivering. Their own community has convinced them that once the British forces arrive, their true nightmare begins. They have heard warnings about what occurs when opposing armies capture a settlement. The brutality their own troops and partners inflicted on other territories now returning. Then footfalls resound on damp cobblestones. Thick boots crushing shattered glass, and the timber boards blocking the doorway start to splinter. British military uniforms emerge in the opening, weapons at the ready. The women retreat into darkness, certain they know what comes next. But these servicemen do something their jailers never anticipated. They drop their arms, ask for fresh water, summon medical help, and depart without touching a single person. Why did German authorities lock these women away as tribute? And why did the British refuse what was presented? This is a Second World War account seldom discussed. If you seek the full story, remain until the final moment. Press like to support this channel, and subscribe so you never miss another forgotten fragment of history. Late April 1945, beyond the hamlet of Rheinbeck near Hamburg, the European conflict had only hours left. Yet for the troops of the British 7th Armored Division, the dawn felt identical to all others, wet, frigid, and tense. Their division numbered thousands officially, but here it reduced to a single squad advancing past charred farmsteads and a wrecked schoolhouse with its entrance sealed by crude planking. Lieutenant James Cooper led the way. His footwear squelched through water pools mixed with cinders. He detected moist soil, charred timber, and fumes from structures still burning after the hamlet surrendered 4 sunrises earlier. A window shutter clattered somewhere in the breeze. Otherwise, quiet hung thick over everything. The schoolhouse doorway was obstructed with timber boards hammered from outside. That appeared unusual. Structures in this area were typically left accessible, containing farming tools, terrified households, or nothing whatsoever. Cooper lifted his hand, and the troops behind him halted their advance. He examined the boards with his palms, then signaled to Corporal Davies, who wielded a pry bar. The steel shrieked as fasteners released. When the boards toppled away, a musty atmosphere spilled out onto the pathway. It brought the odor of dirty flesh, ancient dread, and something acidic that had been confined too long. Cooper's vision required a moment to accommodate the blackness within. Initially, he perceived only vague outlines and motion. Then the outlines transformed into individuals. 19 women squeezed against the distant barriers, their garments ripped and soiled, locks tangled, toes naked on frigid stone. Several appeared scarcely mature enough to have completed school themselves. The eldest showed gray threads in her locks and postured like somebody who formerly held authority. When the British troops materialized in the doorway, the women did not shout in welcome. They withdrew. One young woman concealed her features with both palms. Another started trembling so violently she collapsed to her knees. A girl who appeared perhaps 16 chomped down on her garment to prevent crying audibly. Subsequently, one of them, Margaret Fisher, would report she recalled believing this is the moment they claimed what they sought. Cooper decreased his weapon gradually. He had witnessed deceased troops in meadows, hamlets demolished by bombardment, even the remnants of detention facilities with their awful vacancy. But this seemed distinct. These individuals were breathing and plainly anticipating something they assumed could not be prevented. Behind him, Private Thomas Shaw murmured, "Music. Heavens, sir, what is happening here?" His tone diminished as comprehension arrived. An elderly woman thrust herself vertical against the barrier. Her German emerged fractured with terror, but Cooper grasped most of it, and she attempted several words in crude English. We exist here for you, she music stated. The Bürgermeister, he placed us here. He announced you would claim us. He announced this preserves the hamlet securely. 4 sunrises, no nourishment, minimal water. We await. The realization struck forcefully. These women assumed they had been confined within as a sacrifice, as something to provide invading troops. Cooper subsequently penned to his sibling. They were positive we had arrived to harm them, not because of anything we had executed, but because their own authorities had conditioned them to anticipate it from any military force. He pivoted abruptly. Sure. Retrieve Major Harrison. Everyone else, arms lowered, locate water and provisions instantly. His troops wavered, only a heartbeat, trapped between what the women anticipated and what their instruction had shown them to execute. Within 30 minutes, Major Philip Harrison materialized, his jacket black with precipitation. He was 35, yet appeared more aged, creases carved by months of combat and insufficient slumber. He stepped through the doorway, observed 19 half-famished captives, and his expression went rigid. How extended have they been confined in here? He inquired. 4 sunrises, sir, stated Private Owen Roberts, a medical aide, who had just commenced examining their state. Seely lacking water, undernourished. 3 are in extremely poor condition. They assume we are preparing to. He ceased speaking. Harrison did not require him to complete. He understood the sequence. Intelligence documents had previously referenced 3 additional settlements where German officials had executed something comparable, confining women within structures as presents for British forces, presuming the worst. He rotated to confront his troops. Hear very attentively. These women are non-combatants under our safeguarding from this instant. Obtain more water, whatever field provisions we can distribute. A typical British field provision held approximately 3,000 energy units. Today, some of that valuable nourishment would transfer to former adversaries. Roberts arranged conveyance to the refugee facility in Hamburg and established the directives plainly. Anyone who contacts these women will confront military tribunal without exemption. In that frigid schoolhouse, another acute difference materialized. Outside, weapon discharge still snapped in the distance. Throughout Europe, millions stayed in bondage. Yet here, a cluster of women arranged for mistreatment. Instead, obtained wool coverings, preserved biscuits, and swallows of pure water from battered containers. One of the women murmured in astonishment. They provide us nourishment. Why do they execute this? We were informed all troops are identical. Her words drifted in the particle-filled atmosphere, but this was not an account fabricated for persuasion. It was what genuinely occurred. The British possessed a decision, and in this abandoned hamlet schoolhouse, they selected restraint rather than retaliation. What the women did not yet comprehend was how methodically their own hamlet had designated them for this destiny, and how many hushed exchanges and frightened schemes had resulted in their confinement. Initially, 4 sunrises before the schoolhouse entrance, unsealed on the 19th of April, 1945, the surviving authorities of Rhinebeck Hamlet assembled in a rear chamber behind the municipal building. Outside, individuals could detect distant detonations and the deep thunder of motors as Allied armies advanced nearer. The conflict had endured almost 6 cycles. More than 5 million German troops were absent, deceased, or vanished. Now the combat boundary was at their entrance. Within, the atmosphere was dense and hazy. A solitary feeble lamp oscillated slightly, casting leaping darkness across a timber surface. The Bürgermeister, Franz Müller, cleaned his features with a cloth. Surrounding him rested what remained of the municipal assembly, all males, most too elderly or too vital to have been dispatched eastward. They had invested cycles attending to Nazi transmissions and examining Nazi publications. Those communications always repeated the identical assertions that British and American forces were lawbreakers and barbarians, that they would strike German women and incinerate German residences, that they were no superior than the Bolshevik masses from the Orient. Some of it was complete fabrication, but the accounts about Soviet armies in the Orient carried accuracy. In East Prussia and Silesia, Red Army troops had violated thousands of women as retribution for what German armies had executed in their territory. Whispers disseminated rapidly. By 1945, historians calculate roughly 2 million German women were violated in the concluding months of conflict, numerous by Soviet forces. The precise statistics were ambiguous, but the terror was extremely genuine. In Rhinebeck, individuals whispered, "If this is what the Russians execute, certainly the British will execute the identical." Müller and his assembly no longer believed in formal guarantees. They assumed one thing plainly: the powerful claim what they desire in conflict, and the powerless must present something to persist. One of them supposedly stated, "Superior to some sacrificed, then all annihilated." It was a harsh calculation, but it was the reasoning they selected. So they compiled registers. They instructed the Hamlet Constabulary to retrieve population documents from the Bureau. Documents emitted the scent of ink and particles as they distributed them on the surface. Entry by entry, they proceeded through the identities of women in Rhinebeck. Initially, they searched for those unwed and without offspring. Then they supplemented some young widows. They convinced themselves these women will not be absent as severely. They possess no spouses here, no infants relying on them. Subsequently, Frau Helga Schneider, a book custodian in her 40s, informed a British translator. They announced we had been designated to safeguard Rhinebeck. They selected us like farm animals. We were statistics, not community members. The constabulary departed bearing their registers. Footwear resounded on Hamlet trails. Entrances crashed. At one residence they claimed Margaret Fisher, the meat vendor's offspring, only 17 cycles old. Her father attempted to obstruct them. A weapon struck him in the abdomen and collapsed him to the ground. Her mother shrieked and seized her offspring's limb until another strike dispatched her stumbling. They announced, "I was unwed, with no offspring." Margaret subsequently remembered music they announced that rendered me disposable, that expression remained in my thoughts disposable. At another location they claimed Katrina Faubert, a 23-cycle-old administrative worker from the Hamlet Bureau. She recognized the constable's features. They had formerly exchanged humor about documentation. Now he communicated rigidly, vision firm. "You exist on the register," he stated. "Arrive now." The women were assembled in blackness, their footwear claimed so they could not simply flee. One container of water for 19 individuals, one shared section for their requirements. The crude stone barriers thrust frigid against their spines, particles suspended in thin illumination from fractures in the boards. At darkness, they could detect the hamlet beyond the barriers. Distant weeping, rushed footfalls, the thunder of military transports on the primary route. Some attempted to decline. 3 women endeavored to escape that initial darkness. Constabulary captured them, pulled them back, and struck them so intensely that 2 could scarcely remain vertical afterward. They secured them in the cellar beneath. Catherine stated, "We detected them mourning in the blackness. These were males we had recognized our complete existences. They executed this without pause." The Hamlet authorities attempted to conceal their culpability behind virtuous expressions. They informed the captives they were executing their obligation, that by providing themselves to the British, they were safeguarding German reproduction and the destiny of the people. It was a corrupted adaptation of the identical language the Nazis had employed for cycles, sacrifice, dignity, ancestry. But the accuracy was more straightforward and more repulsive. The assembly had determined these 19 women were a category of tribute. The discrepancy was acute. They communicated of dignity while managing their own individuals as items to be transferred. Historian Anthony Beevor subsequently penned that such episodes were not rare in 1945 Germany. In Hamlet after Hamlet, terror and persuasion combined into the identical acrid mixture, and regional officials executed decisions that would pursue them subsequently in Rhinebeck. Those decisions resulted immediately in the sealed doorway and the filthy stone ground where the women awaited, waiting for British troops to finalize the violation their own authorities had initiated. What the Assembly never anticipated was that those identical British commanders would shortly transform their methodical registers and concealed directives into proof for an extremely distinct objective: not to exploit the women, but to evaluate the males who had presented them. The dawn after the women were located, the schoolhouse remained accessible. Daylight penetrated through the particles. Several vacant provision containers rested near the doorway, the acute scent of preserved meat still suspended in the atmosphere. Adjacent, Major Harrison rested at a temporary timber surface, his moist jacket suspended from a fastener. A typing machine in front of him. The mechanisms clicked as he communicated his document audibly for Lieutenant Mark Collins to transcribe. "Command 7th Armored Division," he initiated. "We have located a cluster of 19 German women retained in a schoolhouse by directive of regional officials. They were to be exploited as intimate presents for British forces under the presumption that we would execute mass violation comparable to actions executed by German armies in occupied regions." The expressions sounded official, almost frigid, but the fury behind them was apparent. Collins, who had been preserving thorough annotations throughout the operation, subsequently penned in his record, "I desired this documented on material, so nobody could ever assert it was merely whisper or rationalization." Harrison's directives from the preceding darkness were now transforming into complete action. By mid-dawn, 2 military transports materialized. Motors clattering, military constabulary descended, crimson caps vivid against their black uniforms. A civil relations commander followed, bearing a dense folder of documents. Medical aides meticulously assisted the women into the transports. Crude wool coverings aerated their flesh, but at minimum they were warmer than the schoolhouse. The steel ground of the transport was frigid under their naked toes. One woman murmured, "Now it initiates." But another indicated the crimson crosses on the medical aides' armbands and stated, "Perhaps negative." Harrison communicated to the military constabulary in a tone everyone could detect. "These women exist under our safeguarding. Nobody contacts them. You will protect them until they achieve the displaced individual's facility in Hamburg. Any breach will be disciplined. Military tribunal confinement." This was one of numerous such facilities the Allies were constructing. By mid-1945, more than 2 million displaced individuals would exist under Allied supervision throughout Europe. Former captives, compelled workers, and non-combatants like these women transferred by conflict from their residences. But while the transports departed, abandoning behind a dim scent of combustion and particles, another portion of the account remained in Rhinebeck. Harrison directed, "Retrieve me, Bürgermeister Müller." The Hamlet authority materialized that afternoon, accompanied by 2 military constabulary. His features were colorless and moist with perspiration. The compact chamber they employed for interrogation emitted the scent of moist plaster, cigarette fumes, and moist wool from troops' jackets. Precipitation contacted against the aperture. "Did you direct those women secured in that schoolhouse?" Harrison inquired through Private Ernst Klein, the German communicating translator. Mueller signaled rapidly. Affirmative. Affirmative. But you must comprehend. I executed it to safeguard the hamlet. We detected what occurred. We detected about the Russians. We assumed if we provided you what you would claim regardless, you would abandon our additional women solitary. So you can find 19 women without nourishment or water, Harrison stated uniformly, and presented them as what precisely? Mueller appeared almost perplexed by the inquiry. As comfort women, he responded. Like the Japanese possess in Asia, like we possessed in Poland and Russia. It is how conflict operates. Is it negative? The chamber went extremely motionless. Outside, a wagon clattered over stones. Within, Cooper, positioned against the barrier, sensed his palms tighten. He had witnessed British medical aides managing wounded German troops, observed troops distributing chocolate with German youngsters, and here was a male who assumed they were no distinct from the militaries that had saturated Europe with violation facilities. Harrison inclined forward. Negative, he stated softly. That is not how we function. You have executed a violation against those women. You anticipated us to complete that violation for you. We did negative, and your anticipation does not pardon you. He rotated to his personnel. We recorded everything. Declarations from every woman willing to communicate, identities of every official participating. Collins, you preserve duplicates of all documents. Civil relations will manage official accusations. Subsequently, that cycle on the 15th of August 1945 in a tribunal chamber in Hamburg that still emitted the scent of recent color and ancient timber, Franz Müller was placed before a British military court. The evaluators displayed British uniforms. The translator communicated tranquil German. Witness declarations meticulously assembled back in April were vocalized audibly. Müller was determined culpable of illegal confinement and conspiracy to enable intimate violation. The judgment was 6 cycles in confinement and permanent extraction from any official position. His situation became one of several hundred comparable proceedings in the British occupation territory, most managing genuine violations or brutal mistreatment. This situation was exceptional. It disciplined a violation arranged in specification, but halted by the exact males it was intended to benefit. Lieutenant Collins subsequently penned the genuine paradox was this. They assumed we were creatures because their own militaries had conducted like creatures. When we declined the function, the only ones remaining to evaluate were the males who had assumed their own fabrications. The judicial activity in Hamburg was only a portion of the account. However, while materials were sealed and judgments vocalized, the 19 women were discovering sunrise by sunrise to exist with a peculiar combination of comfort, fury, and perplexity in their new temporary residence. What they sensed and what they inquired of the British in those initial weeks would reveal a more profound injury than any tribunal chamber could restore. The displaced individuals' facility in Hamburg saturated nearly every chamber of an ancient manufacturing structure. Corridors that formerly emitted the scent of apparatus and lubricant now emitted the scent of diluted vegetable broth, disinfectant, and moist wool. In extended passages, footfalls and tones resounded. There were German non-combatants, liberated compelled workers from Poland and France, and survivors from adjacent detention facilities. In total, several thousand individuals transferred through the structure each sunrise. Portion of the more than 2 million displaced individuals under Allied supervision throughout Europe in 1945. The 19 women from Rhinebeck were provided 3 chambers on the elevated ground. Steel resting platforms positioned near together. Gray military coverings arrayed their flesh. Outside the apertures, they could observe trams transferring past and individuals forming queues for nourishment. It was a peculiar difference. A location formerly constructed for manufacturing, now retaining individuals who had witnessed more than any manufacturing facility could generate. Captain Ella Lanena Davis traversed these corridors with a writing board under her limb. She was one of the scarce female commanders in operations, a former medical worker from Manchester who had exchanged hospital sections for military footwear. She attended meticulously, her footwear contacting on concrete grounds as she transferred from resting platform to resting platform. These women were forsaken methodically. She penned in one document, initially by their regional authorities, then by community members who remained quiet, and conclusively by a structure that instructed them to anticipate violation as typical in conflict. She subsequently informed a partner, "They have been stripped of humanity twice. Formerly by being secured in that schoolhouse, and formerly by being informed, this is what every military executes." Several sunrises after the women materialized, a new figure arrived through the entrance. Chaplain William Morrison, an Anglican religious leader from Yorkshire, in his 30s, with an exhausted but tender features. His canvas religious leaders container contacted softly against his limb as he traversed. The atmosphere in the stairwell was frigid. He could detect boiled cabbage from the kitchen beneath. Captain Davies encountered him at the doorway to the women's chambers. "They are physically superior," she stated. "We have provided them nourishment, pure water, medical evaluations. But their thoughts..." She oscillated her cranium. "They are still anticipating something awful to occur. It is like their terror possesses nowhere to transfer." Morrison inquired if he could communicate with them in a more tranquil location. They designated an ancient bureau. Particles rested dense on vacant surfaces. Sunlight arrived through elevated apertures, rendering the atmosphere appear golden. 12 of the 19 women consented to arrive. They rested in a partial circle of mismatched seating. The scent of ancient material combined with the dim scent of cleaning substance from their initial proper cleansing in sunrises. "I'm not here to lecture you." Morrison initiated through Private Clean, who converted. "I am here to attend and to inform you that what was arranged for you was incorrect. Absolutely incorrect. For a duration, nobody communicated." The clicking of a timepiece on the barrier appeared extremely audible. Then Margaret Fisher, the meat vendor's offspring, observed upward. "Why did you not claim us?" she inquired. Her German was elementary, Klein's English even more elementary. "We were informed all troops executed this. Our authorities stated, it is the method of conflict, but your males transported us water, nourishment," they observed, ashamed. Why? The inquiry penetrated directly to the core of the discrepancy. Women arranged for mistreatment, confronting males who declined to mistreat them. Morrison contemplated before responding. "Some males in every military execute awful things," he stated. "We are not flawless, but our supervisors possess plain regulations. We discipline violation. We discipline robbery. We instruct our troops that non-combatants, even adversary non-combatants, are not objectives." He ceased, then supplemented. "Numerous of our males possess spouses, mothers, siblings back at residence. They cannot envision harming somebody else's offspring and then observing their own offspring in the vision. That is not who we desire to exist. That is not who we attempt to exist." Frau Helga Schneider, the more elderly book custodian, inclined forward. "But you bombarded our settlements," she stated intensely. "My nephew perished in an aerial assault. Youngsters perished. How is that so extremely distinct?" Morrison did not rotate away from her fury. "It is distinct, and it is also not distinct," he conceded. "Conflict itself is a moral catastrophe. Individuals perish who should not perish. Bombarding is intended correctly or incorrectly to terminate the conflict more rapidly, to annihilate manufacturing facilities and conveyance. What was executed to you possessed no such objective. Securing you in a schoolhouse to be exploited was complete manipulation. In another portion of the structure, Dr. Samuel Weiss, a mental health specialist from London, was constructing his own annotations. He communicated to each woman separately, sometimes for a duration. The collision of containers in the dining section beneath drifted upward through the ground. These women experienced what I would designate anticipatory injury, he penned in his document. They were compelled to anticipate intimate brutality in specification. When it did not arrive, the comfort was combined with disgrace and incredulity. One woman informed him, "The British must desire something subsequently. Nobody assists for nothing." She simply could not accept that compassion did not conceal a snare cycles. Subsequently, Weiss's document would be referenced in investigations of injury and conflict as researchers attempted to comprehend how terror can injure even when the terrified action never occurs. In the Bureau, as the exchange with Morrison progressed, that identical collision between anticipation and actuality preserved materializing. "We assumed you were creatures," Margaret stated softly. "Rather, you were typical males. But if you are typical, what does that render our own individuals who designated us for the schoolhouse?" Her inquiry was suspended in the particle-filled atmosphere. This was not persuasion. It was actuality. The women and the British were both discovering that sunrise, how profoundly fabrications and brutality had molded their concepts of what was typical in conflict. While physicians, religious leaders, and assistance workers attempted to restore thoughts and spirits, others were functioning on something distinct but just as significant, establishing certain that what had occurred in that schoolhouse would be recalled, and that Rhinebeck itself would not flee, confronting its disgrace. In the initial months after Germany's capitulation, the territory felt like a location partially dormant. Routes were saturated with wagons and transports, individuals positioned in extended queues for bread that frequently measured less than one mass unit per household. Numerous desired only to disregard, but the Allies demanded some things must not be disregarded. In the British territory, military tribunals unsealed in settlements like Hamburg, Hanover, and Berlin. Between 1945 and 1949, British officials would conduct several hundred proceedings for violations against non-combatants and captives, some for mass termination, some for compelled work, and some, like the situation from Rhinebeck, for intimate brutality and arrangement for it. The proceeding of Burgermeister Franz Müller was only one compact situation in this more extensive endeavor. Yet for the individuals of Rhinebeck, it was an acute reflector, retained upward to their own features. Lieutenant Mark Collins rested in the rear of the Hamburg tribunal chamber when the sunrise judgment was vocalized. The chamber emitted the scent of ancient timber, cigarette fumes, and moist jackets. Precipitation contacted at the elevated apertures. He retained a folder on his lower limbs, dense with carbon duplicates of declarations and his own precise annotations. In his record that darkness he penned, they communicated of safeguarding their women. The documentation demonstrates they designated certain women to be harmed so others might slumber comfortably. They designated this dignity. We designated it what it was, a violation. The evaluators judged Müller to 6 cycles in confinement and prohibited him from official position eternally. Some might have desired more. Others assumed even this too intense for a male who asserted he had only been terrified. But the significant thing was that somebody in authority had conclusively stated audibly this was incorrect. Collins did not halt with the proceeding. Back in his accommodations, he distributed photographs of the schoolhouse, cetography of Rhinebeck, transcribed conversions of the women's testimony, and duplicates of Harrison's original document. The timber surface protested under the mass of material. He saturated notebook after notebook, more than 180 surfaces in total, the abrasion of his writing instrument combining with the collision of consumption containers from the passage outside. This was not persuasion he penned on one surface. It was actuality witnessed with our own vision. Chronicles will recall our conflicts. I desired also to recall what we did not execute. After the conflict, Collins claimed all of this residence with him in Britain cycles. Subsequently, he would transfer his assemblage to what became the Imperial Conflict Repository in London, so that pupils and researchers could examine the expressions of Margaret, Helga, Katrina, and others for themselves. Back in Rhinebeck, existence under British control gradually assumed configuration. The sound of footwear on cobblestone transferred portion by portion to the gentler noise of bicycles and youngsters' tones. New nourishment allocation documents were generated. A hamlet that had formerly suspended swastika banners now witnessed white and azure British military administration symbols secured to its entrances. Because Müller could no longer benefit, the British designated a new burgermeister, Otto Fischer, a tranquil male in his 50s who had formerly invested duration in a Nazi confinement for political resistance. His bureau was a compact chamber that emitted the scent of ancient ink and coal particles from the heating apparatus. One of his initial actions was to summon a community assembly. The hamlet inhabitants assembled in the corridor, their garments repaired, footwear deteriorated slim. Several British commanders positioned themselves along the barriers. There was a murmur of tones, then quiet. As Fischer advanced to the anterior, his palms oscillated slightly as he unfolded a fragment of material. "We must confront what occurred here," he stated, communicating gradually so everyone could detect. 19 women from this hamlet were claimed and secured in a schoolhouse. They were your offspring, your community members, your companions. Our former authorities designated them because they assumed the British would execute as our own troops had executed in the Orient. He observed upward, his vision transferring over the assembly. Numerous of you recognized, some of you observed extremely scarce communication. In our terror, we forsook these women. We managed them as something to be transferred away. We must state this plainly or we discover nothing. A murmur proceeded through the chamber. Some individuals signaled features rigid with disgrace, others concentrated at the ground. Subsequently, one woman who had been in the assembly informed an interviewer, "We desired to communicate only about how we experienced. He compelled us to communicate about what we executed." After the assembly, Private David Goldman, the Jewish troop from Leeds, who had formerly positioned protection outside the schoolhouse, penned to his parents. The material emitted the scent dimly of military ink and the beverage he had distributed on the section. "I do not recognize if what we executed was valorous," he penned. "We just executed what respectable males should execute. Perhaps that is the genuine sorrow that ordinary respectability now senses like some category of miracle. If the existence has descended so minimal that not violating somebody is a magnificent action, then we possess an extended route forward. The route forward would be extended for Rhinebeck, for Germany, and for the 19 women distributed now throughout detention facilities and demolished pathways." But in the hamlet corridor's stagnant atmosphere that sunrise, with Fischer's firm expression still suspended, an initial advance was claimed, the selection not to conceal the accuracy. Numerous cycles subsequently, when survivors and their households arrived back to that identical hamlet, they would position before the ancient schoolhouse and witness that those firm accuracies had been inscribed into steel for all to examine. 50 cycles transferred. By 1995, the hamlet of Rhinebeck was extremely distinct. Music automobiles resonated where equine wagons had formerly clattered. New commercial establishments with vivid apertures aligned the primary pathway. Youngsters operated bicycles past structures that still demonstrated dim scars of bombardment if you observed attentively. The conflict was an account to them, not a recollection. But at the boundary of the hamlet, the ancient schoolhouse is still positioned. Its construction material was gray and deteriorated from precipitation and solar radiation. Vegetation thrust upward along the stone base. On a frigid spring dawn, a compact assembly accumulated there. Hamlet officials, school youngsters, several British guests, and several elderly women with cautious advances and creased features. Among them was Margaret Fisher, now Margaret Thompson, 67 cycles aged. Margaret had departed Germany extended ago. She had united with the British commander she encountered during the control and invested most of her existence in Devon, instructing youngsters who recognized conflict only from transmission and educational materials. Now she had transported back throughout the waterway. The consistent resonance of the aircraft replacing the thunder of bombardiers that had formerly traversed the identical atmosphere. The atmosphere surrounding the schoolhouse emitted the scent of moist soil and recently severed vegetation. A minimal breeze transferred the foliage of an adjacent plant. In the interior of the entrance, a fabric sealed a steel inscription secured to the construction material. The new administrator communicated initially, his tone a minimal unsteady, through the compact resonance amplifier. "We exist here," he stated, to recall something numerous desired to disregard. In April 1945, 19 women were secured within this schoolhouse by our own officials. They were intended to be exploited by British troops. Rather, those troops provided them nourishment, water, and safeguarding. 2 school youngsters advanced forward and extracted downward the fabric, the steel inscription reflected in the feeble solar radiation. Its expressions were elementary. In April 1945, 19 women were confined here by German authorities who anticipated British troops to violate them. The British did negative. They transported nourishment, water, and security. Recall the malevolence that was arranged and the virtue that was designated. Individuals oscillated on the vegetation. Some cleaned their vision. A photographic apparatus clicked. The difference was plain. A location formerly arranged for brutality, now designated as a caution and an instruction. A journalist rotated to Margaret. "How do you sense arriving back here after 50 cycles?" he inquired in German. She observed at the schoolhouse for an extended duration before responding. The construction material, the ceiling configuration, even the scent of ancient stone in the fractures extracted her back to that April sunrise. "I sensed numerous things," she stated conclusively. "Terror, recollection, fury, but also something like tranquility." She claimed a gradual respiration. "I do not communicate this account to render British troops into pure beings," she progressed. "Music. They were not flawless. They were just males executing their obligation in a respectable method. I also do not communicate it to render Germans into creatures. We were a population contaminated by fabrications for 12 cycles. Numerous were terrified, numerous executed incorrect." She positioned her palm on the crude construction material. "I communicate it because even in the most black duration, individuals still possess a selection. Our authorities designated to secure us here. The British troops designated not to exploit us. That selection transformed my existence." Subsequently, she supplemented expressions that remained with numerous who detected them. "We could not assume nobody contacted us. The British could not assume anyone assumed they would in that distributed collision. Perhaps something initiated to restore on both portions." By the 1990s, chroniclers had penned numerous publications about the termination of the conflict. They compared militaries, calculated violations, and investigated how frequently troops struck non-combatants. Their statistics demonstrated that while British forces did execute violations and were sometimes disciplined for them, there was no scheme of mass violation like the one executed by some alternative militaries. It was not automatic. It occurred because commanders imposed regulations, because military constabulary examined, and because adequate troops assumed some actions were simply prohibited. The Second Global Conflict had terminated roughly 60 million individuals around the sphere. In such an ocean of experience, the destiny of 19 women in a solitary schoolhouse could appear extremely compact. Yet instructors in Rhinebeck initiated transporting categories to the location each cycle. At minimum, several hundred pupils arrived annually, contacting the ancient construction material, examining the inscription, and detecting the account. Their instructors informed them, this was not persuasion, it was actuality. Your own Hamlet executed this. Foreign troops declined it. Inquire yourselves what you would execute in their position. In that method, the schoolhouse in Rhinebeck transformed into more than a structure. It transformed into an inquiry presented to each new creation. The British had formally arrived as invaders, with armored vehicles and arms progressing through the pathways. Numerous cycles subsequently, their veterans and offspring returned as guests, attending more than they communicated, examining German expressions inscribed in steel. In a tranquil individual method, they had arrived as invaders and departed as pupil. From the crude construction material of one schoolhouse, the perspective expanded to peoples at conflict, to the authority of fabrications, and to the delicate power of ordinary respectability in a savage period. In the termination, the account of the schoolhouse in Rhinebeck is not genuinely about one hamlet or one cluster of women or one British military section. It is about the minimal boundary that divides liberty from oppression and compassion from brutality. A boundary illustrated every sunrise by confidential selections we almost never examine in chronicle publications. The Nazi structure attempted to instruct that authority determines what is correct. The declination of those British troops and the subsequent honesty of Rhinebeck's new authorities softly responded that authority without moral judgment is only terror in garments. In a conflict of armored vehicles, detonations, and statistics, the most enduring power transformed out to be something more compact and more difficult to calculate. The determination in a black location to witness an adversary as an individual being and to function accordingly. If this story moved you, subscribe to the channel. There are many more real accounts like this. Don't miss the next one.